Welcome to my supplementary lecture. This is the very first supplementary lecture. And in this lecture, I would like to cover some basic information and backgrounds related to the New Testament, and also some historical backdrops. What happened beforehand, before having all these 27 New Testament canon? What is the New Testament? The word testament comes from the Hebrew word berit, which means covenant. It is translated as diatheke in the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is called Septuagint during Jesus' time and his disciples' time. And there is a difference in its nuance between its Hebrew origin and the Greek or Hellenistic usage. For instance, the Greek understanding of covenant is more of a oath-taking or oath-making between two equal size, like business partners. And there are only two passages in the New Testament, in Galatians chapter 3 and Hebrews chapter 9, that translate this word as last will. However, elsewhere in the Bible translates this as covenant. The Hebrew concept, the original concept of this word, is closer to the practices in the ancient Near Eastern culture, which is called the suzerain treaty. It was widely practiced in the Hittite kingdom, and a covenant means a hierarchical or vertical oath-taking in which the receiver of that benefit, or so-called the vassal, pledges his loyalty to his benefactor or the bestower of that blessing. It could be financial gifts or kindness, faithfulness, protection, and any sort of a gift that could be bestowed by the higher rank to the receiver or the lowly. So this view was shared by most of the Jews, and recognizing this concept would help us to define our theological understanding of the New Testament. It is important to note that despite all the differences that I briefly mentioned, all instances in the Bible will, with this word or this term, emphasize the quality of its irrevocable commitment. A covenant making is never a casual activity. It is not like making a promise and breaking it easily, but it is a serious activity. It is a blood involved. Blood shedding would be involved if you break it. It was that serious, oath-taking. So that is where the word covenant or the testament comes from. The word testament or covenant for the two major sections of the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament, and this word means a set of writings that refer to God's special dealing with human beings. And there are some key persons involved in God's covenant making or oath making with his chosen people, the Israelites, such as Noah, Abraham, Moses, and David. The most notable covenant God made with human beings is the one with Moses and Israel in Exodus chapter 19 and 34. And more than 600 years before Jesus' birth on the earth, God already foretold to his people about this new covenant which he will make with his people through the words of the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 31 verses 31 to 33. The fulfillment of this scripture is precisely uncovered through the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. All the books in the Bible, both the Old Testament and New Testament, have coherent themes, principles, and teachings. And we call this, in a theological term, intertextuality. The New Testament is a crucial collection of writings for Christians for largely two reasons, mainly two reasons. First, the New Testament books continue the story on how God fulfills his promises in the Old Testament. Number two, without the New Testament, it is impossible to understand how God of Israel saves his people from the seemingly endless miseries that started since the fall of man. So that is the significance of the New Testament books, or the collection of the books in the New Testament canon. The message and theology of the New Testament books cannot be fully grasped without understanding the Old Testament, or without understanding what happened beforehand. I like what Winston Churchill said, the farther backward you can look, the farther forward you are likely to see. It does not only mean that we have to know the contents or only memorize those Old Testament verses. However, it is holistic understanding, which should encompass the historical, cultural, linguistic, and social background. It's just because we are living in a different world that sometimes it is very difficult for us to understand the surroundings of Jesus and his disciples. We have different way of seeing the world and interpreting it. That's why we should avoid anachronistic interpretation of all the New Testament books at all costs. And without understanding all these multi-dimensional or various backdrops and contexts of the first century AD Jewish and Greco-Roman world, it would be so hard for us to do so. Let us briefly trace the historical accounts between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, as you know, the history of Israelites officially starts with the patriarch Abraham and his wife Sarah. His descendants after Jacob later became the 12 tribes of Israelites, and Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, rescued his people from the great famine by welcoming them to dwell in Egypt. However, it ended becoming slaves, generations of slaves in Egypt. But God thankfully delivered them from slavery through the leadership of Moses and his successor Joshua. God gave them the law, or Torah, and brought them into the promised land in Judea. They prospered under God's protection, and as he fulfilled the initial promise to Abraham to make them a great nation, the most notable historical account begins with King David and his successor Solomon with building the magnificent temple, which is the first temple, Jerusalem temple, a temple for worship, and they enjoyed the heydays of the kingdom as God's chosen nation. However, their nation began to decline by divisions. The kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And by the time of 722 BC, the northern kingdom was invaded and they perished by the Assyrians, who took the people away as war captives as far as Media, which is written in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 5 to 6. Also, in 587 BC, the remaining kingdom, the southern kingdom of Judah, was invaded by the Babylonians under the power of Nebuchadnezzar. And these people conquered Jerusalem, totally destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, the first temple, and they exiled people away, far, far away from their home. And after about 50 years of this exile, almost half a century, the exiled people of Israel were now called the Jews. And the Babylonian kingdom perished, and the next power, Persia, emerged. And thankfully, the king of Persia, King Cyrus, allowed the Jews to return to their homeland and to rebuild their city, their temple, and their walls. So under the leadership of Nehemiah, the walls of Jerusalem were rebuilt in 516 BC, written in Nehemiah chapter 6, verses 15 to 19. At about the same time, under the leadership of the governor Zerubbabel and the guidance of the prophet Haggai and Zechariah, the temple, now this is called the Second Temple, rebuilt and dedicated as well, written in Ezra chapter 3 and chapter 6. This temple stood until it was destroyed by the Roman general Titus in 70 AD. This period of rebuilding of the temple in 516 BC and its destruction in AD 70 is called the Second Temple period, or the intertestamental period. Both the Old Testament and New Testament in the Bible, they do not cover this historical time frame. However, by the help of some of the ancient historical writings, like the works of Josephus, we can know what exactly happened and what took place during this time frame, and it could be divided into 4 major periods. First starts with the Persian period, and during this time, Israel, or Judea, was ruled by a high priest and also a governor, with a very little interference from the Persian kings. The book of Esther fits in the middle of this period, and the Jews considered the synagogue and Torah as the center of teaching and worship, starting from this period. And it was followed by the Hellenistic period, around 332 BC. It started with the conquering power of the Greeks, under the power of Alexander the Great. And the transition took place from the Greeks to the Ptolemies from Egypt and to the Seleucids from Syria. One of the Seleucid kings, named Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who brought so many idol worship inside the Jerusalem temple, and he basically defiled the temple, and he even robbed the treasury of the temple. So the Maccabean brothers could no longer tolerate it, and they rebelled against the Seleucid kingdom. So they began to rule Judea by themselves, and that's the beginning of the Hasmonean period by 167 BC. Josephus writes in details about this in his writing, The Jewish War. And they ruled until the Romans took charge of the entire Judea, including pretty much of most of the Mediterranean area, by 63 BC. And for the rest of the major events, you can see on your shared screen what happened historically during this period. Jesus and his disciples and all the New Testament writers lived in the world under a heavy influence of the Greco-Roman culture. And the Greek influence in the Roman Empire is referred to as Hellenism. Although the degree of Hellenism varied, but its pervasive nature made it almost impossible to be totally free from its influence in various areas of people's lives. There were different responses to this cultural invasion. And even among the Jews, just like any society would react to the foreign culture when they experience it or accept it for the first time. The most neutral and common response is to tolerate the new culture and practices unless they will put the recipient's core, his traditional values in great danger. Let me give you an example today. Well, a lot of young people follow BTS, or so-called K-pop culture these days. And they follow the makeup styles and fashion and entertainment from this country called South Korea, without strong objection, because some of those cultural values are so naturally accepted and tolerated. Likewise, for the Jews during Jesus' time, a great example of such pervasiveness of Hellenism, which was tolerated or even embedded deeply into the Jewish society, could be the Greek practice of reclining at the table. Reclining at the table to eat. For instance, they ate lying down on the floor cushions. In Matthew chapter 26:20 describes how Jesus ate during the Last Supper, and it describes that he reclined at the table. Well, for the 21st century readers like us, we would generally think of the painting of Leonardo da Vinci, which you can see on the top left corner, which portrays Jesus sitting on a chair at the table with his arms forward. However, this is not biblically accurate, and neither historically accurate either. But we should be gracious because Da Vinci was not a theologian for sure. But the more accurate picture of the Last Supper would be something like the picture on the down right side. So this custom of reclining at the table is not Hebrew origin, but it is from the Greeks, as you might have already seen from many movies like Alexander the Great or any movies related to the Greek history. Another Jewish response to the pervasiveness of the Hellenistic influence is that some people would be greatly attracted to this new world, and they would end up widely accepting the newness or anything that's new from the new culture without any strong objections. So this extreme adaptation or acceptance without filtering is written by Josephus, and one of those examples is some young Jewish men who would underwent the surgical operation to look like uncircumcised, which is so-called epispasm. And this was done by the second or the third generation Jews, diaspora Jews usually, who admired greatly the surrounding Greco-Roman culture, and specifically those who wanted to participate at the gymnasium, which is the sport event like Olympic Games. Because they had to be naked to participate or play these sports events, and once they are being naked, people would find out that they are the Jews because they were supposed to be circumcised after 8 days of their birth. So this kind of extreme acceptance of the Hellenistic influence was even being practiced among the Jews. On the other hand, an example of the complete rejection of this new culture or Greco-Roman Hellenistic influence would be like the people group, the Essens, among the Jewish people groups, who strongly opposed in adapting any of the Hellenistic or worldly paganistic influence. They socially and culturally separated themselves from the world, and a typical example of these people, this people group would be like John the Baptist, who lived in the wilderness, having only a pair of shoes and a cloth, and pretty much survived out of all the natural food in the wilderness, and never had connections with the world.